An $80 million private jet failed its final check seconds before takeoff. The engine shuddered violently the moment Connor Hayes signed off on the last inspection, and in front of dozens of waiting clients, CEO Charlotte Bennett pointed a finger straight at him and screamed that he had destroyed her aircraft. Connor did not argue. He did not raise his voice or defend himself. He simply crouched down, picked up a single bolt lying on the hangar floor, looked directly at the director of maintenance standing a few feet away, and smiled. Within seconds, the quiet confidence in his eyes would begin unraveling a scheme that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Stay with this one, because what that engine was hiding is far more dangerous than anything anyone standing in that hangar could have imagined. Connor Hayes had once been the kind of engineer the United States Air Force trusted with catastrophic failures no one else could explain. For 11 years, he had pulled apart jet engines that had flamed out over deserts and oceans, tracing every fracture and every burned wire back to a single point of origin, because in his world a guess was never good enough, and a mistake was never just a mistake. He had a gift for finding the one detail that everyone else walked past, the microscopic crack, the mismatched serial number, the torque value that was off by a fraction no untrained eye would ever catch. Then his wife died in a car accident on a rain-soaked highway outside Denver, and the man who had spent his career chasing catastrophic failures suddenly found himself raising a 6-year-old daughter alone, 3,000 miles from the only family either of them had left. He left the military within the year. Combat postings and overseas deployments were not compatible with packing school lunches and being home for bedtime stories, so he traded a colonel's respect for a contractor's badge at Bennett Executive Aviation, a private charter company that served billionaires, entertainers, and foreign dignitaries who valued discretion above almost everything else. The pay was steady, the hours were mostly predictable, and most importantly, he could pick his daughter up from school 3 days a week. What he gave up was standing. To the full-time maintenance crew, Connor was an outsider, a contractor who showed up, checked boxes, and went home, someone whose 15 years of engine failure analysis meant less in their eyes than 15 years of seniority inside Bennett's hangar. The work itself never bored him, even stripped of its old urgency. Where military investigators were called in after something had already gone catastrophically wrong, civilian maintenance was supposed to be the discipline of never letting it get that far. And Connor approached every inspection with the same unhurried thoroughness he had once brought to wreckage scattered across a runway. He kept a small notebook in his tool bag, a habit left over from his years in uniform, jotting down anything that struck him as slightly off, even when it fell outside the scope of whatever he had been assigned to check that day. Colleagues occasionally teased him for it, calling him the professor behind his back, a nickname that stuck less out of affection than out of the quiet discomfort his precision seemed to create among people who preferred not to be reminded how much they were cutting corners. He never let the teasing bother him. He had buried a wife and rebuilt a life around a 6-year-old who depended on him completely, and after that, very little that happened inside a hangar felt worth losing sleep over. 2 years into his contract, Connor had developed a reputation among the pilots, if not the maintenance crew, as the technician whose sign-off actually meant something. Aaron Collins in particular had come to request him by name whenever schedules allowed, telling anyone who asked that he would rather wait an extra hour for Connor's inspection than fly on someone else's rushed approval. That trust meant more to Connor than any promotion Bennett Executive Aviation could have offered him, because it echoed the only kind of validation that had ever mattered to him in the military. The quiet confidence of the people whose lives depended on his work being right. Charlotte Bennett had built the company from a single leased aircraft into a fleet of 11 jets in under a decade, and the speed of that growth had come at a cost she rarely admitted, even to herself. Investors wanted expansion wanted turnaround times measured in hours rather than days, and Charlotte had learned to run her company the way she ran everything else in her life, at full throttle, with very little patience for delay. She was brilliant in negotiations and merciless with underperformance, but she had one blind spot large enough to drive a fuel truck through. She trusted the people who had been with her the longest far more than the evidence sitting in front of her. Chief among them was Jason Brooks, her director of maintenance for nearly 9 years, the man she credited with keeping her fleet flying while she chased contracts across 3 continents. Jason had started as a competent, unremarkable technician, but somewhere along the way, competence had curdled into something else entirely. He understood the maintenance supply chain better than anyone at Bennett Executive Aviation, which made him uniquely positioned to exploit it. Genuine aerospace-grade components cost a fortune and often took weeks to source through certified vendors, and Jason had quietly discovered a shortcut that padded both his margins and his bank account. He had never expected anyone to look closely enough to notice the difference. He certainly never expected the difference to be noticed by a contractor he had spent 2 years treating like he barely belonged in the building. The scheme had started small, almost accidentally 4 years earlier, when a supplier delay threatened to ground an aircraft during the company's busiest quarter. A broker Jason had met at an industry trade show offered him a set of components that looked nearly identical to certified originals, priced at a fraction of the cost with documentation good enough to survive a cursory glance. Jason told himself it was a one-time solution to an impossible deadline, the kind of compromise every maintenance director secretly made when the alternative was losing a client to a competitor. But the margin he pocketed on that single shipment was larger than his entire quarterly bonus, and the aircraft flew without incident, and the temptation to repeat it proved stronger than whatever conscience he had left. Over time, the arrangement grew more sophisticated, expanding from a single broker to a small network of suppliers who specialized in counterfeit aerospace hardware, convincing enough to pass casual inspection, complete with forged certification paperwork and cloned bat numbers lifted from real manufacturer records. Jason justified each new shipment the same way he had justified the first, telling himself that the parts were close enough, that true failures were rare, that the odds were always in his favor. He had simply been doing the math on human lives for 4 years without ever admitting that was what he was doing. The morning that would unravel everything began the way most disasters do, with a deadline nobody was willing to move. A foreign billionaire investor was scheduled to fly out that afternoon to sign a deal worth several $100 million. And Bennett Executive Aviation had been chosen to fly him there as a show of the kind of white-glove reliability the company had built its reputation on. Jason pushed the maintenance crew hard from the moment the sun came up, cutting corners on documentation and rushing sign-offs that normally took twice as long. He wanted the aircraft wheels up on schedule, and he made it clear to everyone in the hangar that delays would not be tolerated. Connor was assigned to the final systems check, the last set of eyes before the aircraft was cleared for flight, and almost immediately something felt wrong beneath his hands. The coating on several of the fasteners near the engine mount had a faint sheen that did not match the matte, corrosion-resistant finish he had seen on thousands of certified aerospace bolts throughout his career. The inspection tags looked new, almost too new, stamped with a crispness that suggested they had been printed recently rather than issued months earlier through the normal certification pipeline. When he scanned the QR code on one component with his handheld reader, the batch number it returned did not match the part numbers stamped into the metal itself, a discrepancy that should never exist on a properly certified aircraft part. And when he checked the torque specifications on the engine mount assembly, the values were measurably off from manufacturer's standard, not by a careless margin but by a precise one, the kind of number that looked like it had been chosen to pass a casual glance rather than a careful inspection. Connor stopped the process cold and requested a full stand-down until the discrepancies could be explained. Jason, watching the clock and thinking about the investor already en route to the airport, dismissed the concerns outright, insisting the parts had come through the usual certified vendor and that Connor was simply unfamiliar with a recent supplier change. Charlotte arrived on the hangar floor moments later, drawn by the tension radiating from the maintenance bay, and when she heard that the flight might be delayed over what Jason characterized as paperwork formalities, her instinct as a businesswoman under investor pressure overrode her instinct as an engineer's daughter who had grown up around aircraft. She authorized the crew to proceed. Connor, uneasy but professionally boxed in, signed off on the external visual inspection to document that he had completed his portion of the work, but he refused pointedly and on the record to sign the final airworthiness certification. It was a small act of resistance that no one in the room fully understood yet, but it would matter more than anyone could have guessed within the hour. The engines came alive with the low, building roar that every technician in that hangar had heard 1,000 times before, except this time the sound carried a wrongness underneath it, a vibration that traveled up through the concrete floor and rattled the toolboxes lined against the hangar wall. Warning lights flared across the cockpit instrument panel almost immediately, and Captain Aaron Collins, a 19-year veteran with a reputation for never taking unnecessary risks, shut the engines down within seconds of the anomaly appearing. The sudden silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. Charlotte's face went white, then red, as the reality of what had almost happened crashed over her, and in that instant she needed someone to blame far more than she needed to understand what had actually gone wrong. Since Connor had been the last technician to touch the engine bay, she turned on him in front of the investor's entourage, in front of her own staff, in front of the maintenance crew who had spent 2 years watching him with quiet resentment. "You ruined my jet," she shouted, her voice cracking through the cavernous hangar loud enough that heads turned from every corner of the building. Several employees pulled out their phones, and Charlotte demanded Connor's access badge on the spot, effectively firing him in front of everyone before a single fact had been established. Standing off to the side, close enough to see everything but saying nothing, Jason allowed himself the faintest smile, the kind of expression a man wears when a plan appears to be working exactly as he designed it. Connor did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not defend himself against an accusation being shouted at him by the most powerful person in the building. He simply bent down, picked up a single bolt that had fallen loose near the engine cowling during the shutdown, turned it over once in his fingers, and looked up. "This is not a manufacturer bolt," he said, holding it up so the light caught the metal. His voice was calm, almost conversational, which made the words land harder than if he had shouted them. He explained, without raising his volume even once, that the threading had been cut at an angle inconsistent with certified aerospace tooling, that the alloy was noticeably lighter than it should have been for a load-bearing engine component, that the laser etching identifying the batch and manufacturer was faint and slightly smudged in a way that suggested it had been applied with inferior equipment, and that when he had checked the lot number moments earlier, it corresponded to nothing in the manufacturer's actual production records. Jason immediately pushed back, his voice rising as he insisted the bolt was standard issue and that Connor was manufacturing a controversy to save his own job. Connor did not argue with him. Instead, he made a single, simple request. He asked that 3 specific mounting points on the engine be opened and inspected, right there in front of everyone before another word was said. The hangar went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before, the kind of silence that comes when a room senses that something significant is about to be confirmed or disproven. Charlotte, her anger momentarily overtaken by dread, gave the order herself. What the technicians found inside those 3 access points made the earlier accusation against Connor feel almost absurd. More bolts matching the same suspicious characteristics were seated throughout the assembly, along with washers that did not conform to the manufacturer's specified tolerances, and, most alarmingly, a critical engine sensor that had been swapped for a counterfeit unit incapable of reliably detecting the exact kind of vibration anomaly that had nearly caused a catastrophic failure minutes earlier. Charlotte stared at the components laid out on the inspection tray, and for the first time that morning, the fury in her expression gave way to something closer to fear. Connor requested access to the maintenance department's full inventory records, the security footage from the parts storage area, and the digital history of every component replacement logged over the past several months. Charlotte, no longer certain whom to trust, authorized all of it without hesitation and made a call that afternoon to bring in Gabriel Foster, a retired Federal Aviation Administration investigator with 3 decades of experience untangling exactly this kind of fraud. Gabriel arrived within hours, methodical and unhurried in a way that immediately calmed the chaotic energy in the hangar, and he began pulling threads that Connor had already started loosening on his own. What the investigation uncovered was worse than anyone had anticipated. Serial numbers on supposedly unique components appeared duplicated across multiple invoices, a red flag no legitimate parts distributor would ever allow. Purchase records showed line items for premium certified components at prices that, on closer inspection, did not match any real transaction with the manufacturer Bennett Executive Aviation believed it was buying from. Several airworthiness certificates bore signs of digital alteration, dates and signatures that had been layered over originals in ways only visible under close forensic examination. And tucked in a rarely used storage room at the back of the hangar, investigators found a secondary stockpile of components with no documented origin at all, hundreds of parts that had never passed through any certified supply chain. Gabriel worked the way Connor remembered federal investigators working back when he still wore a uniform methodically, without theatrics, treating every document as a piece of a larger structure rather than an isolated red flag. He cross-referenced years of maintenance logs against the manufacturer's own production database, a process that took 2 long days and turned up 17 separate instances where a component listed as installed on one aircraft had, according to the manufacturer's own records, actually been shipped to a completely different customer on the other side of the country. He pulled security footage from the parts storage room going back 18 months, footage that showed Jason entering the restricted area alone, late in the evening, far more often than his role required, always carrying boxes in and occasionally carrying boxes back out. He interviewed the loading dock staff, the receiving clerks, and 2 former employees who had left the company abruptly within the past year, each of whom, once reassured that this was a legitimate federal adjacent inquiry rather than another internal cover-up, admitted they had noticed irregularities but had been too afraid of losing their jobs to say anything. Connor sat beside Gabriel through most of it, translating the purely technical findings into language the rest of the room could follow, and more than once it was his engineering instinct, rather than Gabriel's investigative experience, that identified which discrepancy actually mattered and which was simply administrative sloppiness. Together they built a timeline stretching back nearly 4 years, mapping every counterfeit shipment against every aircraft it had touched, until the scale of what Jason had built stopped looking like a single bad decision and started looking like an entire second business run quietly inside the first. When Jason realized how quickly the investigation was closing in, he attempted to delete digital records from the maintenance department's server late that evening, working alone under the assumption that no one else had access to the system logs. He had underestimated Connor from the very beginning, and he underestimated him again now. Weeks earlier, when the coding discrepancies and mismatched QR codes had first raised his suspicion, Connor had quietly begun backing up every system log he could access, a habit built from years of documenting engine failures, where a missing data point could mean the difference between an accurate finding and a fatal mistake repeating itself. Jason's deletion attempt accomplished nothing except confirming, in the clearest possible terms, that he had something to hide. With the backed-up records in hand, the evidence against Jason became impossible to explain away. He tried initially to shift blame onto an outside supplier, claiming he had simply trusted a vendor who turned out to be dishonest. But Connor calmly laid out documentation showing that Jason himself had personally approved each shipment, that internal emails placed him in direct communication with the supplier over a timeline stretching back nearly 2 years, that the timing of specific component swaps aligned precisely with periods when Jason had authorized unusual cash withdrawals from departmental accounts, and that at least 2 junior technicians had received payments to stay quiet about irregularities they had noticed in passing. One of those technicians, a young man named Tyler Nguyen, who had been carrying the weight of his own silence for months, stepped forward that same afternoon and told Gabriel Foster everything he knew, visibly relieved to finally set the burden down. Cornered by his own paper trail and abandoned by the one witness he had assumed would stay loyal, Jason's composure finally broke. He shouted that everyone in the room was overreacting, that no one had actually gotten hurt, that the parts were close enough to genuine that the difference barely mattered. Then, in a moment that would be described by more than one witness later that day, he tried to walk out of the hangar entirely, moving fast toward the exit doors as if putting distance between himself and the evidence might somehow undo what had already been found. Security stopped him before he reached the parking lot. Charlotte stood frozen near the inspection tray, staring at the man she had trusted with the safety of her entire fleet for nearly a decade, and the realization settling over her was almost harder to bear than the near disaster itself. She had built her company on relationships and instinct, and both had failed her in the worst possible way. The scope of what Jason had built became clearer over the following days as Gabriel Foster's investigation widened. Records showed that counterfeit components had made their way onto several other aircraft in the Bennett Executive Aviation fleet over the preceding 2 years, not just the jet that had nearly failed that morning. The financial trail revealed that Jason had personally profited tens of millions of dollars over time by pocketing the difference between what certified parts actually cost and what counterfeit substitutes could be purchased for through his network of outside suppliers. Suppliers who, investigators determined, had no legitimate aerospace certification of any kind. Several inspection reports connected to those aircraft had been altered after the fact, dates changed, signatures forged, discrepancies smoothed over so that the paperwork would tell a story very different from what had actually been installed inside the engines. Connor, working alongside Gabriel through the technical data, made a discovery that turned the entire hangar silent when he finally spoke it aloud. Based on the wear patterns, the compromised torque specifications, and the failure trajectory of the counterfeit sensor that had been installed in place of the genuine unit, he calculated that if the aircraft had actually taken off that morning as scheduled, catastrophic engine failure would very likely have occurred somewhere around the 30-minute mark of the flight, at an altitude and over terrain that would have left the crew almost no margin for a survivable emergency landing. Every passenger aboard, including the international investor the entire morning had been rushed to accommodate, would have been in mortal danger over something as small and as deliberately hidden as a handful of counterfeit bolts. Charlotte sat down heavily in a nearby chair when she heard the number, unable to speak for a long moment, the weight of how close her company had come to killing an entire planload of people finally settling into her chest. Within a week, Charlotte called every employee of Bennett Executive Aviation into the main hangar for a company-wide meeting, and she stood in front of all of them without a prepared script or a communications team softening her words. She apologized to Connor directly, in front of the same crowd that had watched her accuse him publicly of destroying her aircraft, acknowledging that she had let panic and pressure override judgment she should have trusted from the start. She laid out the entire scope of what the investigation had uncovered, holding nothing back even though her legal team had advised a more careful, gradual disclosure, because she believed her employees and her clients deserved the full truth rather than a managed version of it. She took personal responsibility as chief executive for a culture that had allowed one man's greed to go unchecked for years, stating plainly that oversight failures at her level had made Jason's fraud possible in the first place. She invited the board of directors to attend the same meeting, refusing their earlier suggestion that leadership handle the disclosure separately from the general staff in a more controlled setting. Standing at the front of the hangar with the grounded aircraft still visible behind her, panels open where the counterfeit components had been removed for evidence, she told the room that trust without verification was not leadership, it was negligence wearing a leadership title, and that she had spent 9 years mistaking loyalty for competence in the one department where the difference could cost lives. One of the board members, a soft-spoken investor named Richard Okafor, who had backed the company since its earliest years, asked her directly what guarantee she could offer that something like this would never happen again. Charlotte did not offer a polished answer. She turned instead and asked Connor to stand beside her, telling the room that the guarantee was not a policy document or a new compliance officer. It was the technician standing next to her, now with the authority to stop any aircraft, any contract, any deadline, the instant he believed lives were at risk. Aaron Collins, seated near the front with the rest of the flight crews, was the first to start applauding, and the sound spread slowly through a hangar that had spent the past week held together by nothing but uncertainty. The Federal Aviation Administration opened a formal investigation into Bennett Executive Aviation's maintenance practices within days, and word of the discovery rippled outward through the private aviation industry far faster than Charlotte had anticipated. Several competing charter companies, unnerved by how easily counterfeit components had slipped through a supposedly rigorous inspection process, launched internal reviews of their own supply chains, unwilling to wait and discover the same vulnerability the hard way. Reporters and industry analysts wanted access to Connor, framing him as the technician who had single-handedly prevented a catastrophe, but he turned down nearly every interview request that came his way, declining the kind of public spotlight that would have followed a story like his. When one persistent journalist finally cornered him outside the hangar and asked how it felt to be a hero, Connor simply shook his head and said he had only done his job the way it was supposed to be done. Weeks later, once the immediate crisis had settled into something closer to routine, Charlotte offered Connor the title of Director of Safety Engineering, a senior executive position with a salary and a level of authority far beyond anything he had ever held at the company. He turned it down without much hesitation, telling her honestly that boardrooms and quarterly reports were not where his skills or his interests belonged. What he asked for instead was narrower and, in his mind, far more meaningful. Leadership of a technical investigations team with the explicit, unquestionable authority to ground any aircraft the moment a safety concern was identified, regardless of schedules, contracts, or pressure from above. Charlotte agreed without a second thought, and for the first time in the company's history, a single technician was given veto power over the CEO's own operational decisions when it came to matters of airworthiness. Over the months that followed, the two of them built something neither had expected out of a relationship that began with a public accusation and a badge confiscated in front of a crowd. Charlotte began consulting Connor before major decisions, not out of obligation, but because she had learned, in the most painful way possible, what it cost to ignore someone who actually understood the machinery keeping her clients alive. Their dynamic shifted slowly from confrontation to something resembling genuine mutual respect, professional and grounded, without either of them rushing it into anything more than what it needed to be. There was no dramatic gesture, no sudden declaration, just two people who had been forced by circumstance to see each other clearly, and who chose, deliberately, to keep building something honest out of what remained. Jason's case moved through federal court over the following year, and the evidence Connor and Gabriel had assembled left his attorneys very little room to maneuver. He pleaded guilty to wire fraud and multiple counts of aircraft parts falsification rather than risk a trial, and the judge, citing the number of passengers who had unknowingly flown on aircraft containing counterfeit components, handed down a sentence considerably longer than his lawyers had hoped for. Bennett Executive Aviation cooperated fully with prosecutors throughout, and Charlotte testified in person, telling the court plainly that her company's culture of unquestioned trust had made Jason's fraud possible, and that accountability had to run all the way to the top, or it meant nothing at all. Tyler Nguyen, the young technician who had come forward, kept his job and, at Connor's recommendation, was moved into the newly formed Technical Investigations Team, where his willingness to speak up when it mattered most made him one of its most valuable members within a year. Connor spent much of his time training younger technicians, not just in the technical skills required to spot a counterfeit component, but in the harder lesson of what it actually meant to hold the line when convenience and pressure pushed in the opposite direction. He built a training program from scratch, teaching new hires to recognize the exact details that had first caught his attention in that hangar: the sheen of a coating, the crispness of an inspection tag, the mismatch between a scanned code and a stamped number, drilling into them that a counterfeit part was rarely perfect, only good enough to survive a glance from someone in a hurry. He told them, more than once, that the job was never really about engines. It was about being the last honest checkpoint between a company's deadlines and the lives of the people trusting that company to get them home safely, and that no schedule, no investor, no angry executive standing over their shoulder was ever a good enough reason to sign something they were not certain of. 3 months after that morning in the hangar, Bennett Executive Aviation became one of the first private charter companies in the country to adopt a multi-layered parts traceability system, one that made the kind of fraud Jason had run for years nearly impossible to replicate. Connor spent much of his time training younger technicians, not just in the technical skills required to spot a counterfeit component, but in the harder lesson of what it actually meant to hold the line when convenience and pressure pushed in the opposite direction. Charlotte made it standing policy that no safety-related decision at the company moved forward without Connor's direct sign-off, a rule she enforced herself even when it slowed her down, even when investors grumbled about the extra time it added to their schedules. At the end of most days now, Connor left the hangar right on time, no longer staying late to prove his worth to people who had never bothered to see it clearly in the first place. He drove home to a small house on the edge of town where his daughter waited for him at the kitchen table, homework spread out in front of her, dinner already started because she had grown used to helping while he was still on the road. One evening, Charlotte happened to be driving past that same quiet street after a long day of meetings, and through the front window she caught a brief, unremarkable glimpse of Connor setting the table while his daughter laughed at something he had said. She did not stop the car, did not intrude on a moment that was not hers to witness. She simply smiled and drove on, understanding at last that the truest measure of an engineer was never how fast he could fix a broken engine, but whether he was willing to stop everything the moment he sensed something was wrong. A single counterfeit bolt can bring down an $80 million aircraft, but the honesty of one determined man can save hundreds of lives before that bolt ever gets the chance. The real professional is never the one who works the fastest. It is the one who has the courage to stop everything in front of anyone the second he knows something is not right. If this story stayed with you, there is more waiting just ahead.